My name is Robert Miles. I'm 66 years old, and I've lived long enough to know that life has a funny way of humbling people, especially those who forget where they came from. And the story I'm about to tell you still sits heavy on my heart because it taught me that sometimes the child you raise with love and sacrifice can grow up to be a stranger you barely recognize. It all began on a Friday morning when my son Ethan called me and said, "Dad, I need a favor. Can you drop off some tools at my office?" I forgot them, and since he rarely asked for anything, I said of course. Even though I wasn't feeling great after a long night of back pain, but a father's instinct never dies, so I grabbed the small toolbox he needed, put on a clean shirt, and drove down to his workplace. A big metal and glass company building he'd been bragging about since the day he got hired, telling everyone how important he was there. I was proud of him, proud that he had carved his own path in life. But the moment I pulled into the parking lot, something felt off. He was standing outside waiting for me, pacing, looking nervous, and when I stepped out of the car and raised my hand to wave, he rushed up to me and whispered sharply, "Dad, don't talk to anyone, okay? Just give me the tools and leave." And I froze because the tone wasn't just rude, it was laced with embarrassment, like he was ashamed to be seen with me, his own father. For a second, I laughed awkwardly and asked, "What's wrong with talking to people?" And he glanced around and muttered, This is my workplace, and I don't want people thinking I'm, unprofessional." And that word, unprofessional, hit me like a punch to the chest, because I wasn't walking in wearing pajamas or drunk or causing a scene. I was simply a father doing a favor for his son. Yet the boy I raised, the boy I stayed up dozens of nights for, helping him with homework, the boy whose science fair projects I built using scraps from my workshop, now spoke to me like I was some embarrassment he needed to hide. My smile faded and I handed him the toolbox quietly. But before I could walk away, the security guard opened the door behind him and said loudly, "Morning, Mr. Miles. Welcome back." And Ethan's face went pale because suddenly it wasn't me seeking attention, it was the people around him recognizing me. Ethan tried to step between us, mumbling, "He's just leaving." But the guard shook my hand warmly and said, "Haven't seen you since the annual conference. You gave that speech about leadership, remember?" People still talk about it, and Ethan's mouth literally dropped open, like he had just seen me turn into someone else. And before he could ask what was happening, a woman in a blazer walked out, stopped dead when she saw me, and exclaimed, "Mr. Miles, I didn't know you were visiting today." Then she turned to Ethan and asked, "Why didn't you tell us your father was here? We would have welcomed him properly." And now Ethan looked like a kid caught stealing, his eyes bouncing between me and her as more people started filtering outside, curious about the commotion. Within seconds, a small crowd formed, and one by one, they approached me, shaking my hand, smiling, telling me how much they appreciated the keynote speech I'd given years ago. A speech about resilience that the company still used during training sessions, a speech that I, ironically, never even told Ethan much about because he was too busy that year complaining about his own problems to listen to mine. Turns out the company had hired me back when I was a corporate consultant, long before Ethan ever got a position there. And the only reason he even got the interview was because an old manager remembered my work ethic and recommended giving my son a chance, something Ethan never acknowledged but benefited from deeply. As more and more colleagues gathered around me, asking questions, thanking me, even telling Ethan, "You never told us your father was the Robert Miles," Ethan's face flushed a deeper shade of red. And for the first time, I saw shame, but not the kind aimed at me. It was aimed at himself. After a few minutes, a senior executive stepped out, took one look at me, and laughed with delight. "Robert, good to see you." Folks, if any of you haven't met this man, let me tell you, half of our leadership training content still comes from his work. And Ethan nearly stumbled backward, whispering, "Dad, you worked here?" And I replied calmly, "I worked with them." Yes, and suddenly every colleague who had been ignoring him just a moment earlier was now asking him questions about his upbringing, his pride, his connection to me, making him realize that the father he had been trying to hide was the very reason he had the job he bragged about. After 10 minutes of nonstop attention, the senior executive invited me inside for coffee and I accepted, partly because I liked the man and partly because I wanted Ethan to think about what he'd said outside. So I walked through the doors while Ethan followed behind, silent, small, humbled. Once inside, the executive introduced me to even more employees, some of whom shook my hand like I was a celebrity, and I couldn't help but notice Ethan shrinking in the background. And after a while, the executive excused himself for a meeting, leaving Ethan and me alone in a quiet hallway. That was when Ethan finally spoke, eyes on the floor. "Dad." "I didn't know. I didn't know you used to do all this," and I answered softly, "You never asked." And the truth in that sentence hung between us like a heavy curtain. I continued, "When you were younger, I tried to tell you about my work, the companies I consulted for, the speeches I gave, but you always brushed it off because you didn't think it mattered." And he swallowed hard before whispering, "I wasn't embarrassed of you. I just didn't want to look unprofessional." But I shook my head. "No, Ethan, you were embarrassed of being seen with someone older, someone who dresses simple, someone who doesn't fit your image," and he didn't deny it because he couldn't. After a moment, he softly said, "I'm sorry, Dad." And I nodded because apologies are a start, but they don't erase years of quiet disrespect. Before leaving, several employees waved goodbye to me, thanking me again for my past work. And the last thing I told Ethan before getting into my car was, "Son, never forget, a man who forgets his roots will always lose his balance." And I watched him stand there, looking smaller than he had in years, realizing that respect isn't about age, it's about character. Later that evening, Ethan showed up at my house with dinner, something he hadn't done in years. And although his voice trembled when he said, "Dad, I want to learn more about your work, about who you really are," I felt something soften in me, not forgiveness exactly, but the beginning of it. Because sometimes children need to be reminded that the parents they take for granted once lived whole lifetimes before them, built things, accomplished things, earned respect, and sometimes the world remembers those accomplishments far better than the children who benefited from them. Ethan left my house that night quieter, more thoughtful, and when he hugged me goodbye, it was the first genuine hug he'd given me in years. The kind that told me he finally understood that the man he tried to hide was the same man who had paved half the road he was now walking on.